I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 115th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is our Valentine's episode. It is 2016. By the time this releases, it will be just a couple of days before Valentine's, so hopefully this will be seasonally appropriate. And in our main interview, I'm going to be talking with Professor Amanda Barnier, coming to us from Down Under, and talking specifically about how couples in long-term relationships can use one another to facilitate their own memory. So oftentimes when we're thinking about cognitive optimization, we're thinking about what we can do to make our own brains work better, but let us not forget that as social animals, our brains oftentimes function in conjunction with the brains of those around us, and in particular, those with whom we're very close. There have been a lot of studies that have been talking about how sometimes people can be confounding factors in one another's memory. Think about maybe a teacher standing over your shoulder in a test you were trying to take and how they were screwing up your memory. But it turns out that the opposite can be true as well. Sometimes humans are a major boost to one another's memories. And Professor Barnier has done some very cute Valentine's-y studies on old couples that have been together for decades and decades and decades, and how they can approach memory as almost like a team project and really get some mutual benefits out of that. So hang around for that in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, keeping with the holiday theme, going to talk about some research by Dr. Helen Fisher and a really interesting framework that she's come up with describing what sorts of people are attracted to what other sorts of people as romantic partners that shed some interesting light on the idea that opposites attract, but they don't always attract. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick. But as usual, let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so if you've been listening for a while, you might remember about a month or so ago, one of the episodes had a segment where I was all excited about finding out that dolphins can sleep with one half of their brain at a time. Apparently, some types of birds do this, and it's not altogether unknown. Although, prior to that episode, it was altogether unknown to me. But the weird just keep getting weirder. And so this is not about dolphins, but some recent research at MIT has found that there is a brain circuit, a circuit of neurons originating in something called the thalamic reticular nucleus, the TRN, that is apparently instrumental in the process of falling asleep, and in fact seems to have the ability to put individual areas within the brain to sleep independently of one another. So the TRN, it relays signals to the thalamus and then to the brain's cortex, and these signals induce pockets of the slow oscillating brainwaves that are characteristic of deep sleep. With enough activity inside the TRN, these waves can overtake the entire brain, and that's what we think of as being asleep, or being in a coma, or being unconscious under general anesthetic, or something like that. But studies have shown that sleep-deprived animals can exhibit slow-wave sleep in some areas of their brain while they're still overtly awake. In those cases, local-level alertness within the brain regions that are doing things like controlling muscle activity and controlling awareness of the environment, those parts of the brain might still be in a highly active state despite the slow-wave activity elsewhere. So using optogenetics, and optogenetics, I feel like I need to stop defining it every time we talk about it because it just keeps coming up in episode after episode, but optogenetics is a nifty new trick that I think is just a couple of years old now that allows researchers to stimulate specific neurons or areas of the brain that have been genetically modified to respond to light cues. So then they can feed in a little fiber optic flashlight, essentially, flip that on, stimulate a part of the brain, and then see what happens. So not surprisingly, some MIT researchers decided that they would add some optogenetic on-off switches to the TRN in mice and see how various levels of stimulation would affect the wake or sleep cycles of those mice. And what they found was that weak stimulation to the TRN in awake mice would lead to slow-wave brain activity in a small part of the cortex, says Laura Lewis, one of the lead researchers in the study. When you induce these slow waves across the cortex, the animals start to act behaviorally like they're drowsy. They'll stop moving around and their muscle tone will go down. As the researchers turned up the amount of stimulation to the TRN, the entire cortex would start showing these slow waves, and the animal would become less and less alert. The researchers believe that the TRN fine-tunes the brain's control over local brain regions, and it can enhance or reduce the slow waves in certain regions depending on the needs of the animal or how sleep-deprived the brain is if it really needs to get some rest. This might be what happens when people that are really sleep-deprived momentarily zone out without actually falling asleep. says Lewis. I'm inclined to think that these are the processes happening within the brain as it begins to transition into sleep, and some local brain regions become drowsy even if you force yourself to stay awake. Understanding the finer points of how the TRN modulates sleep could obviously have lots of therapeutic applications, things like improving quality of sleep, getting people into that very deep slow-wave sleep, and also improving things like general anesthetic. One difference between being unconscious and being in deep sleep is that typically when a person is unconscious and anesthetized, their brain's various areas are exhibiting slow waves of activity, but those waves are not in sync with one another the way that they would be within a normal, healthy, sleeping brain. So another score for optogenetics and an area that seems ripe for further research.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
We picked up a couple of 5-star reviews this week on iTunes. Norepinephrine, which I assume is not her real name, says, the smartest podcast on the internet today. There is a palpable sense of intellectual curiosity that comes off of every episode of this podcast. And as of late, they've been on a hot streak of great episodes. And Justin Albers says, I just found this podcast, so I'm behind most viewers, but this is an excellent one. Give this podcast a try. Once you do, you'll watch all of them and become an expert on the most valuable organ in the world. So thank you so much to those of you who left reviews and reached out in other ways over the course of this past week. We got a bunch of feedback, a lot of it on email on the episode that we had a couple of weeks ago on internet porn and its effects on the dopamine system, porn addiction, things like that. Learned a couple of new things, which I will share with you now. One is the word FAP. I gathered this from Gary Wilson's book. One of the big sites dedicated to guys that are trying to break their pornography habit, or girls, is called NoFap, F-A-P. And I assumed that FAP was an acronym for something, but I couldn't quite figure out what it would be. But according to the lovely and talented Rhiannon Rowe, that is not the case. Apparently, FAP is a gender-neutral, net-speak-friendly term for masturbation and is derived from the sound, yes, the sound, of masturbating, as in fap, 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 fap. I did not know that. I apparently have been doing it wrong. But there was that thing a couple of years ago where a bunch of celebrities had nude photos that got hacked on their iPhones and got released to the general public. Apparently, that event was dubbed the Fappening. Maybe you already know about all this stuff. I just found out about it now. I thought that was pretty funny. We did have one doctor, a PhD, that reached out on both Twitter and the website. It really had some counterpoints to say to the issues that were raised by Gary Wilson. Obviously not a fan of Wilson's work. And I really tried to talk him into coming on for a second episode as a good old-fashioned debate. I said I would be more than happy to host and moderate. He was unwilling to do that, so I kind of give the winner by default on that debate that we tried to make happen to Gary Wilson, who was more than willing to come back on and argue his points. His detractor was not, so fortunately or unfortunately, that voice will not be heard. But I do kind of like the idea of hosting a debate in the future if we can find a topic that would be appropriate enough and where I can actually function as a relatively unbiased adjudicator. Hey, thanks so very much to those of you that have already filled out the little questionnaire that we had last week that we put out in the Brain Breakfast newsletter. We're doing a little bit of info gathering here at Smart Drug Smarts, trying to figure out what most tickles your fancy. We had a link to that questionnaire in last week's Brain Breakfast newsletter. We'll do that again this week. If you haven't signed up for that newsletter, I will publicly offer to be your Valentine if you do, and send you an email including XOXOXO. You can sign up for that over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. It's a great way of keeping up on the behind-the-scenes action, of which there's more than you might think. It's been a really busy couple of weeks as 2016 has gotten underway. Lots planned for this year, and the people that are getting that newsletter will definitely be the first to know. And I'd also like to throw down a plug for something that is coursing through my veins right now. I've got 2 pills of Nexus inside me at the moment, which is a significant little brain boost. That is our cognitive stack with aniracetam, CDP choline, pycnogenol, and phosphatidylserine. All in a non-chewable tablet that if you actually chew up and taste would taste terrible, so don't do that. But assuming you swallow it like a regular person, you'll get much better results, and that is available over on the web at axonlabs.io, along with its retail sibling Mitogen. Somebody asked me recently the important question, why do you call it Nexus? And I really wished that I had a better answer, but it was that it sounded cool. But something about the word just has a connotative aura of tech and spaciness and futuristic. I guess anything with an X kind of does that. Anyway, axonlabs.io, check that out. But now let's move on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Professor Amanda Barnier from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. She teaches within the Center for Cognitive Science and is chief investigator of Macquarie's Center of Excellence in Cognition and its Disorders. She does a lot of study into memory, the pros and cons of remembering in groups or remembering alone, and she's also something of an expert in the topic of hypnosis, which we'll not be talking about now, but might be fun to talk about in the future. I came across her work, I want to say almost like 2 years ago, saw an article called Remembering Together, which touched on a lot of the topics that we'll be speaking about about in this interview, but I also sort of slipped it in my back pocket for a future Valentine's episode because I always kind of like doing the holiday episodes when we get a chance, but there's only so many correlations that you can find between neuroscience studies and a calendar full of holidays, so I've got to hold on to these episodes carefully when I come across one of them. So now let's dive in with Professor Amanda Barnier.
My background is in individual memory, in autobiographical memory, and I'm a cognitive psychologist focusing on basic processes of memory. And most cognitive psychology is very much focused on the individual. So what does one individual encode and store and remember? There's not really that much work that has been done on how people remember together. There has been a lot of work looking at social remembering, especially in forensic psychology. But the assumption here has been if you remember with other people, that they can infect your memories, that they can influences you and makes you less accurate. You might pick up false memories and develop them together. So there's been, something of a sort of negative interpretation of how people remember together. And my colleagues and I, and especially my close collaborator, philosopher John Sutton, believe that this wasn't really capturing everything about what we do together and why on earth we would remember, because we remember together all the time, don't we? Families and friends and workplaces and communities. So if remembering is happening all the time with other people, there must be a good reason for it and there must be benefit. What I've been trying to do over the last 10 years is take the best sort of experimental psychology methods around memory from cognitive psychology and broaden them out, extend them out to real groups. So usually cognitive psychology studies of memory focus on sort of undergraduate students who might come into a laboratory and learn a list of words by themselves and then try to remember them later under different conditions. And okay, that's representing one aspect of memory, but what about families remembering together, mums and kids, or older adults, couples, long married couples? What do they talk about? What are they reminiscing about? How do they go about doing it? So we've been taking these really useful methods, one called collaborative recall, and extending it out into these real world groups. And at first this was really challenging because we were trying to think of what's the best kinds of groups that we could test with? Who could we talk to about memory? And I was invited to go and talk to a probers club here in Sydney. So this is a group of retired people who get together, and I went and gave a talk about our memory work. And we thought, married couples, long married older couples, these people are perfect because they've got a lot of these characteristics of what we call groupiness. So they remember together a lot, they share some knowledge together, they're highly intimate. They've got a lot of the characteristics that you would think would be important in successful remembering. So that's kind of what got us started. And since then, we've been collaborating also with developmental psychologists who have been really interested in looking at the remembering between little kids and their parents, because there's a lot of this sort of social memory work that goes on with children. We've been working with younger adults as well, couples, friends, siblings, twins, workplace groups such as firefighters. So trying to extend these ideas out. So our goal is to not only understand how one person remembers, but how two people remember, or three people, or a whole group, or a family, or a company, to really push the boundaries of cognitive psychology of memory.
I'd be really interested to hear about the differences that you see within a romantic couple's memory versus how sort of strategic team memory might work between a parent and a child, or siblings, or something like that.
The first kind of work that we did was with long married older adults who had been married for up to 50 years, and they were on average probably about 75 years old. So the assumption is that older adults are having difficulty with their memory, but we wanted to see whether remembering together would overcome that usual cost that you see. So what older adults have is they have intimacy and they have shared knowledge, and they also use strategies. When they work together, when they remember together, some of them are really good at supporting and scaffolding and prompting and cueing one another. So we found lots of really interesting, rich details going on. But the most important thing we found with the older adults, it's relevant to the other groups that you've just talked about, like parents and kids and friends and siblings, is that not every couple was successful when they remembered together. Some couples were really good at working together and remembering together, so they would finish one another's sentences, or if they had a task like remember the names in your social club, the husband might remember the husband's name, a man's name, and the wife would chime in with their partner's name, and they'd go backwards and forwards and prompting one another. Other couples often really disagreed in the strategies, or they'd have conflict about how to do the task. So one of the tasks was to remember the names of the friends that are in your social group. The husband would say, well, I'm going to do it alphabetically, so just help me do it alphabetically. The wife might say, well, I'm just going to picture them in my mind and I'm just going to think of their faces. They would disagree about the strategy. What we've noticed is that not all groups of people remembering together do equally well. Even when they've been married for just as long, or they report the same levels of intimacy, and we can see that they're doing different things, right? But we don't know why. We don't know where these differences are coming from. And that's what we're trying to work out at the moment. And this relates in the same way to younger couples. So in some newer work that we've been doing, one of my PhD students, Amanda Selwood, she worked with strangers and friends, siblings and twins to look at how these different kinds of groups would remember together or alone. And she found that those groups that knew one another, the friends and the siblings and the twins, all could get some benefits when they remember together, but they seemed to do it slightly differently from the older adults. Whereas with the older adults, if they started arguing or disagreeing about how to do the task, that really didn't help them. If in the young adults, if they started to disagree or fight about how to do it, it didn't bother their memories at all. So they actually did okay even when they were disagreeing. So there seems to be sort of different processes going on between those two different groups.
Did you see much of a relationship between the overall happiness of the couple, how they actually get along with one another moment to moment, day to day, and how well they performed as a memory team?
So in the older adults, we measured their intimacy. But the thing is, they all were sort of what we call it ceiling. They all had really high intimacy scores. And we were measuring things like sort of intellectual intimacy and emotional intimacy. And it's because a lot of older adults, once they've retired, they do actually spend a lot of time together. And so we couldn't really differentiate between them. There were some hints that if there might have been one couple or so who, if they reported that they'd have some ups and downs in their relationship, they didn't remember together quite in the same way as they used to. But we absolutely need some new groups and ones where there's more variation. And I've been really interested or keen to do some work with people who, for instance, might be pre or post marital therapy to see whether having that intervention when you've got difficulty, of course, a lot of other stuff will be going on, but whether that changes their remembering together. Some other work that we're just starting here, we're working with people where one partner in a couple has an acquired brain injury, which is can be a very devastating event for obviously the individual, but also for the relationship and for that couple. And so we've started to do some of this work to see how the person who doesn't have the injury scaffolds or supports the person who does, and how that might change, that change in the relationship. How does it change their remembering together?
Now, you mentioned how it's not a very good idea for two members of a couple that are trying to remember effectively together to use different strategies. In the instances where both team members are using the same strategy, did one strategy versus another win out?
No, it didn't seem to matter which strategy they used. The most important thing was that they implemented a strategy, and that often that they made it explicit and said it out loud. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And so they were, in a sense, we call it being on the same page. When they're on the same page, you could see their performance increasing. So in one of the tasks, we test them 4 times, and you can see their performance increasing, exponentially going up when they're using this explicit strategy. So it can't be an individual strategy, or there can't be disagreements between, because that's really disadvantageous. But being a we rather than just an I. And in fact, what we've found in some of our work, that if we go through later and we record and then we transcribe the way they're talking together during these memory tasks, the number of times that they use words like we rather than I, so the sort of little markers of first person or of me or you or us, actually is correlated or related to how much they remember and how well they do together. So people who talk about we are doing much better collaboratively than the people who keep talking about I. I don't think people, young adults, for instance, when they remember together, need one another to support their memories because their memories are failing. They're not. So in the young adults that we test, they don't get as much benefit from remembering together. I think the benefit there is a social benefit or an emotional benefit because their memories are typically intact. It's when people are older or when they have these challenges, such as an acquired brain injury, it's when their memories are, in a sense, under threat or they're having difficulty with them, that those years or that time investing in sort of shared memory and strategies and ways of doing it together might end up really paying off. And of course, they'll still get social benefits and sort of emotional benefits of remembering and reminiscing and laughing together about what happened. But perhaps the cognitive benefits come from when they really need it.
So when people are effectively working well in pairs or in groups for consolidated memory, as a generalization, would you say that the benefits that they're gaining are quantitative, like they're remembering more things, or more qualitative, sort of the depth of the memory? How emotionally charged is it? Is that the kind of stuff that's improving, or does that vary as a function of age or a function of something else?
Well, I think the benefits that we see are quantitative in terms of people remembering more. I think they can also be qualitative. That is, that people remember richer details, more color and movement in the memories. And I think you can also see benefits in terms of what we call new understanding. That is, new insights, that I have some information about an event and then you tell me some information and together we form a picture and we say, okay, so, I didn't get that because I didn't have all the information. And we call that emergence, that what we think we're seeing is emergence of the amount of information, the kind of information, and the understanding that comes from it that happens together. So I think it can be all of those things.
Yeah, and that phenomenon that you just mentioned, emergence, that can be really great for social bonding also.
Absolutely. And, the really important thing, I think, what's important for us is to recognize that it's not about how much or how accurate you are. It's about conveying something about yourself. It's about revealing who you are. It's about a shared bond. It's about teaching your kids a lesson or whatever it might be. So what people count as memory success, I think, in the world often can be quite different from what we sometimes in the laboratory count as success. And I guess that's what's really important in our work, that we're trying to work out, well, what do everyday groups think of as a successful memory outcome? And how can we look at whether working together actually helps that? So there's a big movement, for instance, in this collaborative recall literature, this paradigm that we use to perhaps think about how that might be relevant to interventions for older adults, let's say in nursing homes, whose memories are failing. But at the moment, we haven't quite worked out, well, what would we get them to do? What would be the task? What for them would count as success? Is it remembering important events from your life, when you were married and when you had your kids or whatever it might be? What is important to you? And I think when we know that, we can really turn these ideas from the laboratory, from experimental work, into some useful interventions.
I did an interview a couple of months ago with a philosopher. His name is John Danaher, and one of the things that we talked about was something called the extended mind hypothesis. I'll just briefly synopsize this for people that didn't catch that earlier episode, but it's essentially the idea that our minds, per se, isn't necessarily all stuff that happens inside of our skull, but it can be things like pocket calculator, which helps us do calculations, or our logbook for appointments that we have that week, which helps us remember things that we might not have available within our biological memory, but is certainly there and easily available to us. I think is a pretty interesting idea, and I'm wondering to what extent you buy into the extended mind hypothesis, and if so, if people within our social group might kind of be a part of this overall extension of our mind.
Well, I buy into it absolutely, in the sense that I think it's a really interesting hypothesis and one worth testing. So I work with a philosopher, John Sutton, who has really been promoting this idea of extended mind or distributed cognition, especially as it relates to memory. So he's been applying these ideas of how essentially cognition extends out into the world and couples with people or things and objects and our environment, but how it supports memory activity. So our goal in working together has been to say, okay, this is a really interesting philosophical idea, but how do we bring it into the laboratory? What we have to do, I guess, is to split it up into some ideas of what would an extended mind look like? What would be evidence that there's a group mind or a collective mind or something like that? And what's the right size group to work with? We've got a whole cognitive psychology of the individual. How do we push that out to 1+1? Let's start with 2 people. And so that's why our work has been on pairs of people, whether it's couples or mums and kids or whatever it might be, and saying, well, what would an extended mind look like? Cognitive psychologists have recognized that the context you're in, the environment that you're in, or people around you can act as a cue. So you might remind me of something that happened last week, but I wouldn't necessarily need to call you part of my mind, right? Because you're just sort of a hook or a cue out in the world that's helped me to remember. The processes are still mine in my head. So what would evidence then look like of us having an extended mind where we're genuinely coupling together in our cognition? And that's going back to those ideas of emergent. When together, we can be more than the sum of our parts, that we can come up with answers that neither of us could do alone. And in our work, I guess we're not just trying to think of, well, what would the outcome look like? But we want to know, okay, well, what are the actual cognitive processes or the parameters or conditions, like what conditions do we need to meet as individuals or as groups in order to have this experience of an extended mind, or for this to be a good explanation of what goes on. And that's why I was talking about things like long history together, shared knowledge, intimacy perhaps, and strategies might be some of the components or the conditions that would need to be met in order for us to say, okay, I think we might see an extended mind. We use the term transactive memory system. We've been working for 10 years just to answer the question, is distributed cognition a thing? Is it a helpful explanation? So the basic question we were trying to answer is, do you get costs or benefits of remembering with other people? Because as I said, most of the cognitive psychology of memory work has done this work in laboratories with undergraduate students who don't know one another, remembering pretty mild kinds of stuff, and they usually do worse when they remember together. So a group of 3 undergraduate students remembering together will do worse, remember less, than 3 undergraduate students remembering alone. We've been trying all these years to find situations in which real-world groups do better when they remember together, and that's what we see in the older couples, which I think is really exciting because normally older adults have problems, like I said. So here's a circumstance in which you might be able to really help people, give them advice about making sure that they keep cognitively active, that they keep socially active, because sharing memories might be a tool for staving off cognitive decline and dementia. So that's sort of one whole direction of research that we've been working in. But the one that we've been sort of thinking about now is we know that some people get benefits, but not all groups get benefits, and we don't know why. We don't know which groups. What are the individual abilities or skills that a person brings into a group? So how do you build a good group? How do you build a successful memory group? And this seems to us really relevant, whether it's in families or in the classroom or in workplaces or as we age. Sort of, why is it that some collaborators are really good, sensitive, successful collaborators, but others are not so great? And can we identify ones who are having difficulties? And can we help them? So in some of the work that we've been doing with the older adults, we've noticed that in one particular case, we noticed that an older adult couple, they had some hearing problems and they were having trouble doing the remembering task basically because they couldn't hear one another. We know that hearing deficits are correlated with an earlier onset for dementia or for an increased risk of dementia because they can't hear one another, and that if they can't hear one another, they can't bring into play these ideas about a just transactive or a distributed cognition. They can't support and scaffold one another cognitively. So is that why they then go on perhaps to experience cognitive decline? I don't know. These are some of the hypotheses that we're busy kind of working to test now.
One question that I've got is, do you think that you might sort of be aiming at a moving target as you're studying memory now, especially how people's memories advance over the course of decades, when we have so many technologies now that are essentially recording things for us and allowing us to search and call things back? Is the stuff that we discover about normal biological memory now in 2016 going to be particularly relevant in the year 2040 or things like that based on the amount of extra recording technologies that we have?
I'm going to say maybe yes and maybe no. I mean, John Sutton and his collaborator, who's an English historian named Lynn Trubel, have been doing work on distributed cognition and extended mind in Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. And the idea is that even back in Shakespeare's time, they didn't print out copies of the plays of Hamlet or whatever, so the actors had to use whatever they could, including obviously their brains, their minds, plus the environment and one another, to remember all that dialogue and all those directions and how to perform that play. And Lynn talks about Shakespeare's Circular Globe Theatre as being designed in a way to provide a whole bunch of external cues to support the actors in remembering this stuff. I think the idea of scaffolding, of supporting memory, is a human constant, and it's just maybe the nature of it has changed. I mean, when you walk through almost any, here I live in Australia, almost any Australian town, you'll see memorials to Australian men and women who fought in wars or who were lost in wars. And these are things in our landscape that remind us about sort of what's happened and what's part of, you know, our history and our identity. So there's all different forms of external scaffolding. I think the processes are still going to be the same. Maybe it will change a little bit because there's some other work that's been talking about the fact that because of the online nature of our lives at the moment, maybe this will upset a little bit normal processes of forgetting and remembering. And just to make that more concrete, when I was young, if you've been going out with someone for a long time, you'd break up with them and it was sort of done. And if you didn't see that person, you didn't see that person. And your kind of mental processes of remembering or forgetting, of suppressing that person might be able to kick in. But with our really online connected lives, I mean, if you're seeing them on Facebook all the time or on Twitter or Instagram or something, actually those normal processes of forgetting or suppressing thoughts or memories might actually become different or a little bit harder. So there's some things that are really constant and long-term and have been going on forever with human memory, but perhaps the connectedness of our memories in our lives might change things a little.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much for Professor Amanda Barnier taking the time for that conversation. Needless to say, I think that this is a really interesting topic. I think that one of the things I find myself being continually fascinated by is how concepts deconstruct when you really look at them carefully into less and less easily categorized entities. Like, this show is ostensibly about how do I make you smarter, which on the face of it sounds pretty well defined. But one of the things that just keeps coming up again and again and again is how smart can subdivide down into all these finer grained interacting subcomponents that overall add up into behaviors that would be associated with a smart person. And similarly, how do I make you smarter? An episode like this is really kind of breaking down the you, like what is the you? We think about it as the person that has a driver's license, the person that has a social security number, but then you can start really getting fuzzy with that. Like, to what extent are your cognitive processes overlapping or being outsourced to the people around you, to the devices that you're working with? To what extent are the symbiotic bacteria and microorganisms that are living in and around your body part of you or not part of you? I think we've really got sort of a never-ending fractal set of Russian dolls as we look into these issues, but that means we've got a lot still to talk about in future episodes. So all good stuff. But now, keeping it on theme for the holiday, let's do the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So some scientists managed to carve out their intellectual domain so clearly that nobody else better mess with that for a long time to come. Copernicus, you could easily imagine him saying, look, I'm Copernicus, I'm the sun at the center of the solar system guy. Jane Goodall, you know damn well she's got gorillas covered. Anybody that makes expanding and contracting geodesic anything knows that they will always be standing in the shadow of Buckminster Fuller. And as far as I'm concerned, for human romantic relationships, it's going to be hard for other people to make the sort of dent that Dr. Helen Fisher has made in that particular subdiscipline. She is all over the place with publications on human romance. I first read a book of hers called The Anatomy of Love maybe 7 or 8 years ago. She's a really readable author as well as being a research scientist, and she's an anthropologist by training rather than a neuroscientist, although she oftentimes works with neuroscientists on some of the research that she's performing recently. But I think that anthropology background tends to make her written work a little less dense than some other science texts. Anyway, I was looking for something that would be Valentine's appropriate for this week, and not surprisingly came across something that had Helen Fisher's fingerprints all over it. I thought this was really interesting, but she's broken down all of humanity, which is always a dangerous thing to do, but into 4 personality buckets, which has tons of crossover and that nobody falls exactly perfectly into one bucket, but they are interesting divisions and they make some sense. We'll talk about why in a second here. But then looking at how each of those buckets tends to choose romantic partnerships, either inside or outside their own buckets. And that's where this gets interesting. But what are the buckets first? Well, our first group of people, our first bucket, are men and women that seem to be expressing certain genes in their dopamine system that makes them less introspective, more intellectually curious, mentally flexible, and creative. She says the overall style of thinking that is associated with these people tend to be curious and energetic, and she calls these people explorers. Her next group of people tend to have slightly elevated activity in their serotonin systems, and this is linked with heightened observation of social norms, following the rules, respecting order, adherence to plans, methods, and habits, self-control, conscientiousness, and religiosity. So you might think of this personality archetype as the librarian that shushes you and tells you you're being too loud when you're giggling in the library, and she calls this group the builders. The third bucket, prenatal endogenous testosterone priming, essentially that's getting a little bit more testosterone when you are in utero, is linked with enhanced visual spatial perception and a keen understanding of rule-based systems, from mechanics to computers, math, engineering, music, etc., etc. These people tend to be a bit less socially aware. They have poorer emotion recognition, less verbal fluency, reduced empathy, and extreme sensitivity to rank. Fisher describes this group as being analytical and tough-minded, and she calls them the directors. And finally, having a bit more estrogen exposure while in utero. And again, although we think of testosterone as being male and estrogen as being female, both sexes are getting exposed to each of these chemicals. And so it's certainly not that all directors are going to wind up male or that all the people in this last bucket we're talking about are going to wind up female. But prenatal endogenous estrogen priming is associated with contextual, holistic, and long-term thinking, linguistic skills, agreeableness, cooperation, empathy, and nurturing. These do sound like traditionally female qualities. Also, generosity and trust, the drive to make social attachments, and a heightened memory for emotional experiences. Fisher calls this trait constellation prosocial/empathetic and calls this bucket the negotiators. So we've talked about these buckets now: explorers, builders, directors, and negotiators. And she put together a 56-question survey to identify where people fall within these groups. Again, nobody is 100% in any one group. It's all going to be 27% builder, 13% director, or whatever. Some people are going to be straddling the four corners, and other people will be more polarized in one camp or another. But thanks to our friend the internet, Dr. Fisher was able to team up with a dating site, chemistry.com, and she gave this questionnaire to almost 40,000 anonymous men and women. So she identified which men and which women fell into which buckets and how strongly they fell into those buckets, and then was able to look at correlations among the people that they chose to reach out to through chemistry.com, how those dates went, and for people that wound up actually going on a date and meeting a person who had also answered this questionnaire in person, what their impressions were, and particularly whether they thought this person might make a good long-term mate. Basically, after one date, did this person kind of clear the threshold that they're worth going on a second date with? Here's where we start to see some of the old conventional wisdom that opposites attract romantically, but also some of the equally obvious truisms that opposites don't always attract. If you are an explorer personality type, you are more often than not going to be well paired with another explorer. Explorers are mutually curious, they're not too held up on the details, they like to go off and get into adventures together. You can kind of see why this works as a couple. Similarly, builders and builders match. Remember, the builders were the people that had a little bit more activity in their serotonin systems than might be average, and for whom playing by the rules and sticking to social norms was of preeminent importance. So you can see why these people might work together well also. This is kind of like the conservative button-down couple that go into church every Sunday and making sure that all the dishes are done and the kids are doing their chores on time and lights out by 10 p.m. and that kind of stuff. They tend to work together well as couples, and they tend to recognize that they work together well as couples. And if you're a builder on your first date and you find yourself sitting across from another builder, you're likely to say, yeah, this person does have actual long-term dating potential. But the last two groups, the directors and the negotiators, they tend to be cross-attracted to one another. As you might imagine, it's a little bit more common for men to be directors and for women to be negotiators, although this is not always the case. But either way, these two opposite behavioral groups do tend to be attractive to one another. These groups tend to be complementary, particularly in their decision-making styles. While the director is likely to focus on smaller pieces of the puzzle with extreme depth and clarity, he might be missing the big picture, whereas the negotiator is probably able to see the whole forest and not just the trees, but on the other hand might miss the very important detail in a couple of the trees. And so according to Fisher, each tends to respect the cognitive powers that are readily apparent in the other person that they might be aware of their own failings in. The negotiators tend to vacillate, whereas the directors can be really decisive, but the director might not have the verbal acuity or the negotiation and the people skills to make other people go along with it. So if you think in the context of a romantic couple and what that might wind up with in a family, if you've got a director father and a negotiator mother, once the couple makes a decision on what the family is going to be doing, the father may be the one to finally put his foot down on a decision, and then the mother may be the one to get everyone to go along with it. If you're a kid trying to get your parents to go along with some harebrained scheme and lend you the family car or something, you'd probably be a lot more likely to ask the negotiator parent because you realize you'll probably be able to get them to see your side of the issue a little bit better than the director might. Anyway, needless to say, these buckets are not the be-all, end-all of human relationships, but it is interesting to think about where you or people that you know fall within this paradigm and think about the relationship matches and do they fall into one of these likely types, the builder with the builder, the explorer with the explorer, or the director with the negotiator.
Smart Drug Smarts, where we turn information into sound, into bits, into packet data that turns back into bits and sound, and then into neurotransmitters that release funds that release mail-order synthetic chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier to release augmented performance from your brain.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode number 115, our Valentine's 2016 special edition. If you want to show your love to somebody on this Valentine's, then why not pack up a nice romantic email full of Smart Drug Smarts episode links to some of your favorite episodes and send that over. One thing that I was not able to make myself save for Valentine's, although I considered it, was the semen episode that we had 7 or 8 months ago. That's potentially seasonally appropriate also. We could also do a chocolate one on theobromine for next year's. That's probably a pretty good idea. In fact, I will throw out a blanket request. If you're looking at your calendar trying to figure out what holidays are coming up and something strikes you that, ooh, that would be a great topic for a Smart Drug Smarts holiday episode, give us ideas about that stuff. It's always fun to see what people come up with. We've got a couple of great listener recommendations for episode topics that have come in over the course of the past week. So thank you to all of you that are dropping tidbits on us. The notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/115, along with the links to everything that we talked about here. And I will be back at you next week with one of 2 episodes. I know it's going to be one of these 2 things. I'm not sure which of the 2 it will be just yet. We may be talking about nootropics and terrorism and how these 2 seemingly unrelated subjects actually have some overlap. And we may be talking about psilocybin, that's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, and its potential therapeutic effects on depression. So our long-awaited psilocybin episode finally seeing the light of day. I'm sure that there's many of you out there saying, about damn time, Jesse. But that'll be next week, or maybe it won't. Maybe it'll be the week after that. But regardless of the topic, I will be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week until then, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.